All right, we're live. So I'm recording hot mic. I can hear everything you guys are saying. I can hear everything you guys are thinking. Hi, good morning. And it is recorded in the Zoom room. So keep that in mind. All right, let's talk about media queries. So media queries, the thing that we covered kind of briefly earlier this week, are that way to make your page adjust depending on a variety of conditions. If you think back to pseudo classes, when certain conditions are met, or if certain conditions are met, excuse me, then some certain CSS will apply. Also, since we're live, your guys' distracting tab should be closed, especially at the front of the room where I can see that you're not listening to what I'm saying. And your phone should be zipped up like we have been practicing. So I've added some extra resources in here that if you, after today's lesson, you need some reference or some extra explorations. Maybe if you're trying the challenge, thinking about this mobile first idea. There's lots of links here for you guys to check out, for you to keep for your notes, and another how to write media queries walkthrough, just in case it still does not make sense or you're still needing some extra help after today's display. So what actually is 6.1 asking of us? We have to think about the structure before we start thinking about the responsiveness of the CSS. We're going to have two exercises. So we're going to contain it all into one HTML page and use divs, kind of like we did on 5.2. And we're going to use our variety of CSS style sheets to make these specific conditions true so that the CSS happens within them. It's a lot of talking, but all that is to say, you guys should have VS Code opened up and then go to File, Open Folder, and make sure that you're in your second period web design OneDrive folder, because I definitely have a couple. And we're going to open up our Unit 6 root right here. So we'll click on that. This is what we've got so far. This is what I've demonstrated for y'all. So if I go live on this real quick, we should just have a, did we walk through the multiple style sheets, making sure they connect so that you can see blue div is working, yellow div is working, and black and white div is working efficiently. This makes sense. We've seen this before, right? Okay. I'm assuming that's a yes. So what we'll do now is start actually going through the media query process on these specific style sheets for each specific function, for each specific condition that we're trying to meet. So if we go back to our contract, the thing that we're actually being asked, let's focus on this number one first. We have some basic HTML structure that we've done the extra large font, but we still need to do white text on a blue background. And we're going to use a media query for 800 pixels or more wide. So since we already have our div, we already have, let me go back to it. We already have our blue div right here that's being affected by the 200% font size. We just need to match that to what the client's actually asking of us. Sorry, I lost my place. And we're going to do that by going to, let me close my other tabs here. We're going to go to the blue style, and in our div.blue CSS, we're going to make it appear the way that the client is actually looking for. So we're going to set that color to be white. And we're going to set that background color to be blue so that our client has a little bit more of what they're actually looking for here. So if we go back to my output on div.blue, we've created a blue div box, 200% font with some white text. This is CSS we're used to. This is totally normal, totally stuff we've seen before, nothing different there. However, the client on the contract has added a stipulation that the page needs to be a certain size in order for this CSS to happen. And we're going to use a media query to create that responsiveness, to create a way that our page is going to change based on the end user's configurations. So to do that, there's some really simple syntax that a media query always uses. And there's a couple things that are always going to be included. It's entirely in CSS. And I'll leave a little kind of walkthrough or a note on how to break it down in this tutorial, as well as attached to our agenda for the day. So when you write a media query, the thing that's going to respond dependent on how your user's configuration is on the end, you're always going to start with @media. You can see it turns pink like that. This is going to tell our CSS document that we're looking for a certain condition to be met. You can see my CSS is already mad at me. It does not like the @ sign because we have not finished our media query yet. So once you write @media, you have to either set a media type. There's three main ones that we're going to stick to, or you can leave it blank and set them to all three. Now that second option, leaving it blank, doesn't really serve much of a purpose because we're intentionally trying to make a specific condition be met before we do anything crazy. So the three types of media that you don't have to set like a type equals like in a Zelda link. But the three types of media that we're going to be focusing on are going to be screen, print, and speech. So you got to choose one of those. And there's also all, which is also the default, if no specific. Like this. You have to choose one of these three, and it just comes in a space right after the @media qualifier. And then you're going to write your specific query that is going to be asked of us here. Screen, if your device has a screen, it's a media type of screen. So unless you're divining this HTML from the ether with your brain, you're probably going to be setting a media type to be screen. So other than that, print is going to be if you convert it to a PDF or you try to run your web page through the printer, you can make it change specifically to increase that legibility on a physical piece of paper. And then speech is specific to accessibility features, users who need a screen reader. The speech media query is going to change the way that your web page appears if that media type is met. If there's a screen reader enabled, then whatever CSS you have inside of the media speech query will be applied. And then all just sets it to all three of these, and it just kind of responds generally to the next part we're going to talk about. I don't usually use all. I usually am stuck to screen or print. I pretty rarely use speech. But anyway, the next part, you could write just your media query for that being media type of screen. But that's just basically regular CSS. We need to add a little bit more specifics in order for this thing to actually work in the way that we intend. So then what comes after the media type, once you've selected your first one, you write the word and then inside of these parentheses, or sorry, after you write and, you write parentheses, and this is where you can put additional, I'm going to close this real quick so you can see my whole screen. Additional, I think that's how you spell it. Additional conditions to be met. And some of those additional conditions that need to be considered are going to be mid-width, min-width, or max-width. Those are the ones that I use most frequently because I'm typically using CSS media queries to make my page respond. Hi, good morning. To make my page respond a lot better from between device types. So to recap, we set our @media to a specific type. And we've added this and condition, and usually inside of the parentheses with the and condition are the additional conditions that need to be met, such as min width, which will set to something, or max width, which will set to something. So that is all in essence your CSS selector, similar to div.blue. You need all these, or at least all these pieces for your intent, for your specific design, before you can actually start doing the next part, which is after these parentheses, curly bracket, enter. And inside of this curly bracket, we've built a media container. We've written our if condition. Now we write regular CSS. So we have our selector, whether that's for a class or an element or an ID, whatever, the usual CSS that we're used to, we have our selector. And then inside of here, we have properties and values. You can have multiple properties and values, right? This part right here is just normal CSS that's going to occur when the media query becomes true. And these are the basic kind of bones of a media query. I'll add this into a comment so it doesn't get too mad at me. But this is what we're going to be focusing on while we make our page a little bit more responsive. So I'm going to comment this out real quick, and I'm going to add that to our agenda later if you need a reminder. Let's actually look at the application of what our client is looking for here. So first things first, our client is very likely using a screen. So we're going to write our media query and set it to screen. That's the first step. Anytime your user has a screen device, we're going to go that way. And they also have a specific size that they want us to work with. So let me close my output. You can see nothing's changed because we just still have our div.blue styling. But if we go to the contract, we have this CSS when the page is 800 pixels or more wide. So that or more is the key thing that I want you guys to look for when you guys are given contracts, when you're given freelance jobs for web design. Or more and or less mean two obviously very specific things. And there's an easy way to remember it. So we've set our media media screen, excuse me. Then we're going to write our and condition, our extra specific part. Inside of the parentheses, we're going to set the min-width to be what our client is asking. 800 pixels. Now, it's really tempting to get into the CSS habit of putting a semicolon after this because we have a colon, and in essence, it's kind of a property and a value. You do not put a semicolon right here because that will break your media query. I know it's kind of frustrating, kind of annoying, but in media queries, you just leave the min width or whatever specific type of extra condition you're adding to there, you leave without a semicolon. They live within the parentheses. So this is going to set up, what this means is our computer's going to ask, it's going to make a query, it's going to ask a question. Hey, does this device have a screen? Yes. Okay, that condition's true. Is the minimum width 800 pixels? Is it 800 pixels or larger? Yes, that's also true. All right, our condition is true. So that means whatever CSS we put inside of these curly brackets is going to occur. Conveniently, we've already written the CSS for what our client is asking for right at the top here. So I'm going to Control X this, delete these empty lines, and then just paste that tab inside of my line number 9. And then the normal CSS lives inside of that query. So when the certain condition is met, the CSS applies. The way I want you to remember this, the min width versus max width, is that min width equals your starting point. This is where whatever CSS you have written inside of your media query, if you're using min width, that's the device size that it's going to start at, that it's going to begin at. So to recap, we've got our media type set to screen. We have a starting point of 800 pixels. So that means at 800 or at or above 800 pixels, then this specific CSS is going to apply. If we go to our output, my monitor is 1200 or 1280 pixels wide. So let me grab, I have a little screen ruler here. I want to pull it up real quick. 1 second.
What does it say after and additional conditions to it?
Like min width or max width. So if I pull over my screen ruler, you can see my device is 1280 pixels wide. Because we are larger than 800 pixels, our media query is true. I'm using a screen and it's 800 pixels or more wide. So since this is the only CSS on div.blue, once this becomes false, the condition is no longer met, then the CSS inside will no longer apply. So if I go to my output and I resize my viewport here, we're still above 800 pixels. I'm going to just slowly resize that, make it smaller and smaller until we've gone below 800 pixels. The condition's no longer true. The CSS stops applying. So if I pull out my screen ruler real quick, just in case you're skeptical. Any day now, screen ruler. Take your time. Okay, 796 pixels wide. So once I make my viewport or my browser window larger than 800 pixels, that's the starting point. We've hit the 800 pixel mark. Then the CSS inside is going to apply. Does that make sense? Because we're going to write another one for the opposite of max width being the ending point here in just a second. Any questions on the setup of this so far? Anything look too scary? Makes no sense? It's totally normal. It's totally fine. Computers are scary. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next part of our contract. So the next part of our contract is the on the yellow CSS sheet, because we have normal sized red text, so we don't need to set a font size because it's normal. But we do need to change the color and the background color when the page is less than 800 pixels wide. Okay, so I'm going to navigate with my Explorer to my yellow style CSS sheet. I'm going to close blue style for now. Here we have our div.yellow. I'm going to set the color to be red. It's going to affect everything that's not the background. This is the CSS that our client wants to happen when the certain condition is met. Okay, so first things first, how do I start my media query? What's the first thing I write? Yeah, Jim. At media, exactly. Okay, so at media, what type of media am I working with here? What am I looking at? What's my screen? Exactly. Okay, so our media is set to screen. That's our first part of our condition. We need an and inside of the parentheses, instead of going min width being our starting point for our CSS to apply, we're going to set a max width, max dash width of 800 px. And this is going to function as our ending point as compared to our starting point. So I'm going to do curly bracket here like that. I'm going to go max dash width equals ending point as compared to starting point. Comment that out real quick so that you have a little reference for how to keep these things in mind. And then we're just going to copy and paste our div.yellow. Copy that. Sorry, I meant to cut that so that it stops affecting when certain things happen. So I'm going to cut that, put my media query on top, tab over to make sure that I'm nested one level inside of the query, Control V. We now have written a conditional statement. If our media is a screen and the max width is 800 pixels, so that means no larger, then the CSS will apply. This is going to be our ending point for whatever CSS happens in here. So if I go back to my example, or my output, I mean, when I say output, I'm talking about how the web page renders or how it appears. You can see that since we're larger than 800 pixels right now, we've crossed our starting point. The blue div media query is happening. But if I resize my viewport to less than 800 pixels, you can see that blue div is no longer true, so that CSS stops applying. But yellow div becomes true, so that CSS does start applying. So this means that once we hit 800 pixels, if I slowly resize my viewport here, the second that we hit 800 pixels, it's going to shift when the conditions swap the truth state. Okay, hold on, I'm almost there. Slowly but surely. Come on. Come on. Come on. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so now we've passed 800 pixels. We've passed our ending point. So this CSS or this media query is no longer true, whereas this media query, the starting point, is true. And this is 90% of the time I'm using media screen and a min width or a max width to create something called a breakpoint. So if you think about this, blue div in essence is going to be the media query we write for our desktop-based web page, the one that's going to look the most normal or the most designed, most laid out, whatever, on a typical computer, on a typical desktop screen. However, if I was using my phone or my tablet, I'd want it to be a little bit more phone or tablet shaped. So I'm going to write a media query that creates a breakpoint to maintain the layout of my page so that it doesn't look too crazy, dependent on a variety of different screen sizes. It's kind of the general application use case of media queries. We need to write one more because there's another media type that we need to work with. If you go to your contract here, it says black and white text or black text on a white background when the page is printed. So these are both screen related media types. What type of media is printing? It's crazy. Yeah, it's print. So we're going to go to BW style. We've got, I'm going to take this border off because we need to set it back to the default of color black. And we need to set the background color to white so that when we print this page, certain CSS applies. Okay, so this is the styling that our client is looking for, just returning the default. The only reason I'm setting it back to the default is because we've made these changes on yellow and blue style. So we need to have just a little backup to ensure that our page is looking nice when it gets printed or converted into a PDF. Okay, so I start my media query with @media. What was my media type for printing? Print, exactly. Now, print is one of those all-encompassing conditionals that we don't really need an extra detail or an extra thing that needs to be met. Media print, @media print, excuse me, is typically going to work for our needs in this specific use case. So then curly bracket, copy or cut my div.bw and cut that out. Put my media query on the top, get rid of some of this empty space. Tab that one layer over so that it's nested inside of the container. Control V. There we go. We have written a media query for when our web page gets printed or turned into a PDF. So I can't check this with Firefox or with Live Server because if I click on my print button, it doesn't, I mean, it kind of works, but it doesn't work the way that I need it to. Okay, so just to ensure, you guys don't have to do this part, but just to ensure that my print query is working, I'm going to set my font size to 6,000%. Something a little crazy so you can actually see how large it gets when this media print becomes true. It does not work with Live Server for some reason. So if I click on my print button in Firefox, well, of course it works now. It wasn't working all day yesterday. Anyways, you can see that it's completely cut off. it's our blue and yellow div are still up here. See, it's still even not working the way I anticipated. So our blue and yellow div are up here, but our black and white div, because it has that specific media query, is being applied whatever CSS is happening in there. And the reason that is, I just realized I forgot a step, is because we don't want only the div.bw to be affected by this size. We want the entire web page to change when we go to print the page. The entire web page is contained, or the entire visible web page is contained within two main types of containers. That's body and that's HTML, right? You could set it to HTML, but that includes all of your head brain data. It's usually a little much. You can just write a rule for the body, but if you want to be extra sure that it's working, extra sure that it's affecting your entire page, we're going to go to our BW style. And instead of doing div.bw for our selector, we're going to write body, comma, HTML, and make this CSS apply to both of these separate selectors equally. This is just adding these comma HTML is the addition of something called parity, Parity, which just means that you kind of have a backup plan, or that you kind of have a, I forgot what the term means in math, but parity just means you have a backup plan. If you think about, like, if you're setting up a RAID server with hard drives, parity just means they'll be able to fix themselves if something goes wrong. Either way, so that's not the point. Setting your selector to be body, comma, HTML is going to allow this CSS to affect the entirety of our page here. So when I go to print this, it's going to be massive. Everything contained within those body tags and those HTML tags is going to be whatever I set this media query to be. So I'm going to comment this one out because I don't need this. If I go back to my output here, print that, it's just going to turn it into a normal page. So, like, for example, if I go to blue style and I write something that affects the entirety of my body, we'll just set the font size to 6,000% again. Okay, font size is 6,000%. When I go back to my output, it's insanely massive. It's way more than I'm able to work with here. Too much. So, for example, I go to print this page. It's still, why does it still have? Hold on. Commented it out. Brown. It's behaving well. I mean, at least when I go to print it, it is taking the CSS off and turning it into the correct file type. So you can see if I go switch to PDF, this is set to color. If I were to save this as a PDF, this file is in color, so our black and white is applying correctly. I'm going to take this font size of 6,000% off. That didn't work the way I intended to, but it's okay. So those are the three media queries you're going to need for exercise 1, and we'll get into exercise 2 here in just a second. And then the rest of today is finishing up 6.1. So check I'm going to go in order of blue, yellow to black and white. We'll start with the 6.1 HTML. Check yours against mine and make sure that it's looking good. Also check your file structure. Make sure that your root folder is looking similar to mine. I'll give you guys a second to do that. Yes.
Why should we be doing 3 separate style sheets?
It's just to show you that you can link multiple style sheets.
Oh,
You can write media queries that make certain style sheets apply when certain conditions are met. So, for example, if you wrote a style sheet for your mobile version of your web page, a style sheet for your desktop version of your web page, and a style sheet for your tablet version of your web page, on one master CSS document or main CSS document, you can write media queries that insert that style sheet depending on if the condition is met. Is the use case I see most frequently besides things like this. Okay, so I'm going to move on to blue style, focusing on the blue div. Check your CSS in your query against mine. I'm going to add this green note at the top to our agenda for today, so you don't have to copy that. I know you can't see the whole thing, but you don't have to copy that. I would personally add the min width equals starting point because then it's a good note to keep, a good comment to have, just in case you need a reminder when you revisit these pages. Okay. Couple more seconds for that. Gonna move on to yellow style now. Check your yellow style against mine. All right, I'm gonna move to black and white, the print media query. Okay, check yours against mine. Make sure it's looking similar or functioning in a similar way. You don't need the font size. That was just for demonstration purposes. Check yours against mine here. All right, and if your page is behaving like this, when you resize it to less than 800 pixels, the yellow div turns red. When you go bigger than that, it turns blue. And when you print the page, if you're using Chrome, you can right click and there should be a print option, but I'm using Firefox, so I don't have that. Edge should also have that too, but if you print it, it should just turn normal like this. Okay, so if yours is looking like that for exercise 1, you're in a good spot. I'm gonna go back to my 6.1 and add a little H1 here, type H1 and hit enter. It's gonna auto add my start and end tags. I'm gonna label this exercise. I think that's how you spell it. Exercise 1. Okay, I'm gonna add a little horizontal line. Let's move on to exercise 2. Like this. All right, H1 for exercise 2. Exercise 2. Spent a little, oh, we're still good on the Zoom time. We got a 40-minute limit, so I'm gonna wrap it up at least by then. Okay, exercise number 2. We're gonna use CSS media queries that write a page that first, we need some structure. Shows red, green, and blue squares using divs side by side. So we're gonna be just editing the display property when our certain conditions are met. So I'm gonna go into my HTML. We're gonna go div.red, enter. Let's call this red box. Repeat that process for blue and green. Div.blue, enter. This is blue box. Okay. And then enter one more time, div.green, and hit enter. This is green box. But you might notice that in doing this, we have some conflict here. Line 21 has a div with a class of blue, but line 15 also has a div with a class of blue. So that means that both of these lines are going to be affected by this media query right here, since div.blue is our selector for that specific CSS to happen. We don't want that. We want 2 separate exercises happening here. So the way you can get around this, I'm gonna actually delete all these divs because I want to show you something, is you want to set both a class and an ID in one instance, in one edition. And if you use dots for the class names and IDs for or hashtags for the IDs, you can do that all at once and quickly add both of those attributes like this. So if I go div.blue hashtag box like this, when I hit enter, it's going to add both that class and that ID attribute to whatever I set it as. Hello, good morning. So we're going to go, blue box here and repeat that process 2 more times for our, sorry, blue shouldn't be first, but that's fine. We want red, green, and blue. So I'm actually going to, backtrack a little bit. Div.red hashtag box. Okay, this is red box. And then after, then we'll go div.blue hashtag box for blue box, and then div.green hashtag box for our green box. So here's our HTML. We have classes and IDs for specific functions that are based on these, based on what we're looking for. Now we need a style sheet to actually make the basic styling happen before we start adjusting the positioning. So click on the style subfolder, make sure you have the solid blue rectangle, add a new file with the new file button. We're gonna go 6.1 EX2 for exercise 2, capital S style to get some separation between the 2 and the S there, and then .css, okay? I'm gonna write a quick little bit of CSS. We're gonna go div.red hashtag box, the same way that we wrote it in the HTML. Curly bracket, enter, set the background color to red. And then once I've configured this one time, I'm just gonna copy and paste and adjust it so that I don't have to start from scratch every time. So this is gonna focus on divs with a class of red and an ID of box. That's only one HTML element right there. So it should look like we're intended. So I got 10 minutes left here, we're on the clock. Okay, I've already written this, so I'm gonna Control C, Control V, change this class from red to blue, and change that background color to blue. All right, and repeat that process one more time for div.green. Set the background color to green. Okay, now I've got my three basic stylings happening. I'm also going to add a width and height of 100 pixels so that I can actually see these boxes line up in a row versus a column. Then I'm just going to copy those two properties and values and add them to each of my other ones like this. So this is exactly the same CSS repeated 3 times so that you have the basics of your stuff happening here. But this won't happen until we link our 4th style sheet to this HTML document. So I'm going to go back to my 6.1, go underneath my last link. I like to keep them in order of creation, but I mean, it doesn't really matter the order inside of the head, inside of the website brain. I'm going to type LINK, hit enter, start with the subfolder first of styles, and then I'm going to add this 6.1 ex2 style.css. Then right after that, I'm going to add a type equals text/CSS. Just another Zelda link that connects the 4th and final style sheet for 6.1 inside of our web page brain. If we go to our output, you should see, well, blue box is still being a little weird. To get around this blue box being weird, you can go into your div class of blue and add a B for blue box and just change that over here, blue B as well. Any changes you make to your HTML, you also need to make to your CSS. And now we should have 3 boxes and a column. So remember, divs are block level elements. They're going to create a new line every single time that you put one into your page, even if it's only taking up a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. So what we do to get around that, actually, sorry, let me rephrase. So we have our div, our red, green, and blue squares side by side is what the client's looking for. These are vertical because they're creating block levels. So what we're going to do is go into that exercise 2 CSS and write a display property of inline-block. If you remember back to earlier units, inline versus block level elements, block's going to create that new line, inline's going to make them line up. However, by combining inline and block with a hyphen, you retain any width and height property you add to a specific element, like an H1, a table, anything like that. Inline block is going to make it retain its size, but behave like an inline level element. I'm just going to copy that single property and value, Control V to each of mine here. Like this. There is a way to do this more efficiently, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to also spell out every step so you can see later on. If we go back to our output, hooray, our div boxes have appeared in a line as compared to a column. Now, we need to write a media query on this style sheet that changes that display back to block, sets it back to the default. So when the condition is met, then the blocks will stack up in a column as compared to existing in a row. So how do I start my media query? At media. What's my media type? Screen. Okay. And what's my condition? We go back to the contract. My condition is less than 800 pixels. So if I'm using less than, do I use min width or max width? Did I hear min width? I think. Let's try min width. So in my parentheses, I'm going to add a min dash width of 800 px. Remember, do not add a semicolon for the purposes of media queries. Enter. I've built a container for my CSS to apply here. Now we're going to go efficiency's sake for both time and both for efficiency of our code. The same way we wrote body, HTML, we're going to do the same thing for all 3 of these divs. So I'm going to go div.red hashtag box, comma. I've already written all that out, so I'm just going to highlight this, Control C, Control V, comma, Control V. Change each of these to be blue B, because remember we added that capital B in order for it to behave the way we needed it to without conflicting with the earlier div. And this one is just back to normal green, not regreen. Green, hashtag box, and then curly bracket in here. We're going to write the same CSS. We're going to set one display property back to block so that when this media query is true, all 3 div.red hashtag box, div.blueb hashtag box, and div.green hashtag box are going to set their display back to block. As compared to writing this much code, we can write 3 lines instead of 18. So if we go back to our output, oops, that's not the right one. Since we're above 800 pixels, you can tell because our blue div is active. If I resize my viewport, you can see they're gonna adjust. So when blue div becomes true, they're in a column, but when, wait, hold on, is that backwards?
Yeah.
Yeah, we want the squares to display in a column. So instead of min width, because min width is our starting point, if we go back to blue stop, we want to use max width. Max width is going to be our ending point. So change that min to max, Control S. So when I go back to my output, 800 pixels. When 800 pixels stops being true, they're going to display in a row because they're going to switch over to inline block. And when it's less than 800 pixels, they're going to display in a column, which is just the default of block. So if your page is behaving like mine, when you full screen it, you have a row of div boxes and a blue div active. And then when you resize it to more of a mobile screen size, you have a column of div boxes and a yellow div active. You have done this exercise correctly. All right. And then we can print it just for good measure. And you can see that if you really wanted to change the print query, you could on exercise 2. I'm not that concerned, but printing should look like that. Okay, so here is your CSS for exercise 2. Check that against mine. We got 3 minutes left in the Zoom room. Make sure you have all the pieces. Make sure your div.blueb for exercise 2 has some kind of differentiation between the div.blue from the first exercise. Your CSS is looking like this, including the media query. After that, I'm going to go back to my HTML so you can check underneath exercise 2 right here. Make sure that yours matches mine.
I have a question.
Yes.
First exercise, you need the black and white div because
It's just to make sure your style sheet is linked. It's like a dashboard light. Okay, so if your HTML looks like this for exercise 1 and 2, there's exercise 2 CSS. You can pause the video later. There's blue style CSS. Again, you can pause the video later. Yellow style CSS, and then finally, black and white style CSS, all contained within our 6.1 root. The last and final step is to make sure that our index page is running correctly. So I'm going to turn off my live server for exercise 1, close this tab. I'm going to go live on my index page for my whole root folder. Okay. This is my home page. It's looking pretty bare at the moment. Remember, you can add lots of decor. You can leave notes for your friends. You can add whatever CSS you want to the page here. I don't mind, but the only thing that is required is that you have links to your HTML pages so that I know for sure that you did the work. So when I click on 6.1, it will open up to the demo that we just did. And my media query, if I resize this viewport like this, is still functional. Okay. If those two things are true, there's your media query for 6.1 in HTML index. If your condition of functional is true, then you have finished up 6.1, and you can just leave it in your root folder until we submit it this Friday with whatever 6.2 has in store. So we got 1.5 minutes left in the Zoom room here. Does anybody have any general questions that I can answer before I help you guys with your specific debugs one-on-one? Are we all good? All right, perfect. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it. I know it's boring when I lecture all day, but I want to make sure that you guys are getting this so we have time to actually troubleshoot. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to close the Zoom, and then the rest of our day is finishing up 6.1.